Now well documented in scholarship. For those who want to read more about it, there's an excellent work by someone called Hunaydi, Sahar Hunaydi. She wrote a fantastic study on this. It's very, very detailed. But the remarkable thing of that instance is that it starts the end of the third phase, which is that phase of imperial questioning, because what happens is that there's a return to the original sin, which means that you have to then suppress the population. Now, in 1929, of course, after the population is suppressed, it regains its energies. And once again, egregious forms of colonialist acts take place on the ground. There's displacements in the villages. There is severe pressure on the local population. People riot when stuff like that happens. They start attacking the colonists. They start attacking the army that protects them. They incur injuries. And they incur deaths sometimes. And they get called violent, not peaceful. The imperial power starts calling again for peace. We want peace. Why aren't you peaceful? Why are you so barbaric? Why are you such terrorists? This is the kind of talk that was being said back then. People were killed en masse at the time. The British Army response was brutal. But after engaging in pacification, they got that moment that I described a minute ago of imperial questioning. Should we be doing this? Once again. And they established the Commission of Inquiry. And this time it comes up with a very comprehensive report, the Passfield paper, which says, look, we need to find a root solution to this. Let's establish another detailed body that will investigate what are the conditions for this. So some guy called Hope Simpson is sent, and he comes up with a report. It's a very well-known document. It has various recommendations. It says, every time we suppress these people, they will rise up again, because there are structural factors that create that. Basically, you cannot sustain the colonization of this land. There isn't enough space for the Palestinian peasantry to give away to colonists who eat up land in huge amounts, do not use it, actually misuse it. And this was the interesting, some of the most fascinating bits of the report, is comparing native agricultural practices, which were very effective actually, to some of the misuse that these colonists that were claiming that they were turning the desert into green space. Yeah. Anyways, all of these recommendations come. The Passfield paper gets announced. And people start feeling, okay, maybe this policy will end. But no. After an intense period of Zionist lobbying in London, and here we're talking, by the way, again, we're thinking of the Gentile Zionists having a major role in this. Yeah? They put a huge amount of pressure on the Prime Minister at the time, MacDonald. He issues a black paper negating every single potential policy improvement that could have come out in that period. An even more disastrous thing happens then in 1936. By then, the native population had gotten so fed up with this. It was, the amount of the colonists was growing at such an exponential rate Why was it growing? Because of the hypocritical policy of Britain and America, which was closing the door to Jewish immigration in those countries and telling people, okay, you want to immigrate? Here, go to this little place called Palestine. Knowing full well that there's people there, that this means the displacement of those people, that this forms an existential threat to human beings that have lived on that land for ages, that have rights like everyone else, that can breathe like everyone else, that can work, touch things, feel things, that have concerns in life. Yeah? But we don't expect racists to think in those terms, because they don't. They don't actually think at all about native populations. They're not on the radar when it comes to those people. Essentially, in 1936, it gets so tough for the Palestinian people that the whole country rises up in revolt. This is the first time that it's not just like a one-day incident or a two-day incident or a one-week incident. No, it starts with a general strike that lasts for more than 6 months, the longest strike in history. It starts with a whole range of activities across the countryside. And the British, for a moment, could not find a way to pacify it immediately, because you need to send in more forces, you need to find other solutions. So initially they seek another form of pacification, which is, let's use the native leaderships that we have around to keep the population quiet. And actually, the Arab governments around are all connected to Britain somehow, somewhere or another. So the Palestinian population gets a letter from the Arab kings calling upon them, quote, to go back into peace, end of quote. And تخلدوا إلى السكينة, which is even more intense than going back to peace. It's like go to sleep. Yeah? That was a letter that was sent to them. And the local leaderships were like, okay, that makes sense. Let's go and see what our great friend, Great Britain, this was another term that was used in the letter, how just will it be? What kind of policies will it apply? It did nothing. And the people then rose up again. And the revolt lasted until 1939. And more than 6,000 people were killed to stop this legitimate revolt that was demanding independence, that was demanding this end to colonization. That was actually the last attempt, major attempt on the part of the native population to protect its presence on its land. One in 10 of the adult male population in Palestine was either killed or injured in that revolt. British sent in the same troops they had used in Ireland, actually, for this. They developed the counterinsurgency methods that they had applied in Ireland and used them in more extreme forms there. When you start, by the way, studying these counterinsurgencies, you start learning that people develop this stuff. They start modifying it and it becomes more effective, more deadly, more destructive. And at the end, more peaceful, because people go far more quietly by the time they're over with the job, by the time they're done with it. They started home demolitions then. All this stuff that you see the Israelis doing now started in that cycle. And they said, look, we're not going to start talking to the population until we completely get them suppressed. After that, maybe we'll have some discussions and we'll see what can be done. After all, you know, we're on the eve of a war and we need to keep them quiet for a longer term. And that's what happens, all right? And of course, by the time the revolt ends in 1939, the British make all sorts of promises. They don't go anywhere, these promises. They put some limits on Jewish immigration, but it's already too late. The settler colonial community in the country had grown to about 30% after it was less than 5% in 1917. This is exponential growth. It's remarkable. And then 48 happens, and the settler colonial community engages in the ultimate form of pacification. Again, they're fighting in the name of peace. They want peace. They want survival even. They're claiming that they're going to be thrown into the sea if they don't do this. Their form of pacification that they select was to throw people out. You want people to be quiet, you throw them out. You want to take someone's house, you know, you don't just come in and live in it. Yeah, because, I mean, some settlers actually do that now. They go in and live in people's homes in Jerusalem. But what ends up happening is they can bother you, you know. They can be noisy. But what you do is you pacify them by kicking them out. They're not in the house. They can't make any noises. You don't care if they're shouting down in the alley. Yeah, you can lock the doors, you can do double glazing. That's it. Yeah. This is pacification. This is the continuation of the process. And now they keep telling us peace. In the 50s, the Western governments who were so complicit in this policy kept engaging in pacification efforts now of the refugees outside. They were telling the Arab governments, get these people to shut the hell up. Resettle them. We don't want to hear their noises. We don't want to listen to people who are saying, I want to go back home. I want my right of return. Get them to stop crying. That's pacification. They tried to impose on regional powers at the time a peaceful settlement. There was nothing peaceful about that, because peace means, in this case, dropping your rights. That's what it means. Stop demanding your rights, that's peace. Stop calling for your actual, inherent, fundamental, human desire to go back to your own home. You shouldn't think like that. No, you're being violent if you think like that. The whole concept then is set up on portraying the refugees as an obstacle to peace. And you know what? They are an obstacle to peace in the sense that they need peace, which is an end to people's demands for justice, an end to people's demands for living a normal life. Yeah? This is what peace means now. They do war after war after war. Even the 1967 war, they called it a war for peace. Preemptive war for peace. What does that mean? Yeah. You go, you occupy people's countries. You take over their lands, and you call it peace. Keeps on going. It's all pacification, actually. If anybody tries to be in solidarity with the native population that's been displaced, they have to be silenced. Whether by military, a full military show of power, as was done against Nasser, for example, in Egypt, or by policies of severe intimidation, harassment, and blackmail of the sort that we continue to see up to this very day practiced in the West against those who try to stand up with the Palestinians verbally even. Because the whole idea is to pacify even the voice. Even that has to be completely eradicated. Now, the most remarkable thing about this process is that if we wanted genuine peace, we wouldn't be calling for the Palestinians to be quiet. We'd be calling for our governments to arm them. People who were interested in peace in the 19th century, by the way, used to be committed to the struggles of, for example, the Poles who had their country occupied. They provided them with shelter, arms, and tried to help them regain their country. Yeah? People who were interested in genuine justice in places like Spain went on brigades, volunteered in citizens' armies, got their governments, or tried to convince their governments to stand on the right side of justice, on the side of people's rights. But instead, Western governments today, including the government of Canada, arm the Israelis. They speak of peace while providing weaponry to the oppressor. They speak of peace while providing them with nuclear weapons. Yeah? Germany, just a few months back, gave in some extra nuclear submarines to the Israelis. Britain, since the 1950s, had been giving them heavy water. The French built up their entire nuclear infrastructure. And the South African apartheid regime gave them uranium. Okay? All of these people talk about peace, but they're actually building up the capacity for pacification, for destroying the native people, for threatening their very existence. So this is the ultimate hypocrisy, but it's not just hypocrisy, it's more than that. It's something very dark happening here. There's a conceptual paradigm that we need to overcome. Now, part of the way they control our minds is to force us on the defensive all the time. Yeah? Don't talk about arming the Palestinians. Who talks about that? You know, you can talk about arming anyone in the world. You can talk about arming the Libyans, you can talk about arming the Syrians, but no arming the Palestinians, demanding that the Canadian government sends arms. Are you crazy? Never. As for arming Israel, it doesn't matter. Nobody talks about that. Yeah? So not only do they not help people fight off the yoke of this force that oppresses them, this force of apartheid and colonialism, they also enable that force to practice all the full range of horrendous acts that it does. Starvation, mass imprisonment. By the way, the prisoners are still on strike. There's been record numbers now, more than 240 days in some of their cases. Why don't we hear about that? They've launched something they call the battle of the empty stomachs. They're not involved in peace. They don't demand peace. They demand a battle for freedom. And by the way, for all of you who have read about South Africa, people there weren't demanding peace. They're talking about democratization. They're talking about ending apartheid. People in Rhodesia were not talking about peace. They're talking about justice and end to racism. People in Algeria were talking about independence. Since when have we started appropriating the terms of those who aim to control, to suppress any challenge to injustice? When we talk about these things, we should talk about liberation. That should be our discourse. When we discuss concepts, we should break the barriers and stop acting on the defensive and speak very frankly that we are actually anti-Zionists. You know, we shouldn't go into long prefaces of, yeah, and, you know, we believe in peaceful, in two sides, and this and that. It's not two sides. And there's a huge range now of anti-Zionist Israelis and Jews that recognize that it's not two sides. They're on our side. Because it's a battle for them as well as for everyone else. It's a battle for justice and humanity in that place. It's about creating the conditions for the long-term coexistence between peoples on just grounding, on a basis of equality. That's what we should be fighting for. Equality, liberation. We should even be fighting for fraternity of peoples. But peace? Come on. They've vulgarized the term. They've turned it into an actual mechanism for pacifying our minds as much as they've turned it into a mechanism for pacifying an entire population, oppressing it, dispossessing it, and forcing it into conditions of utter desperation. Because pacification at the end of the day is about creating despair. It's about destroying the will to fight in any form or shape. So the best thing that we can do, and this is the last thing I'm going to end on, is enable, in whichever way we can, try to help enable the Palestinian population to resist. And the first step towards that is to stop providing the Israeli government, the Israeli apartheid regime, with the mechanisms for oppressing their people. Some people call that BDS. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is stop giving aid and support and institutional arrangements that enable oppression on this earth. Yeah? It's a very simple thing. But no, they create all sorts of barriers around it. They complicate it. They make it sound like it's a very, you know, there's moral ambiguities around it. No, it's not ambiguous. Somebody is beating the hell up of someone in the street. You don't give them extra sticks to beat them with. You don't cheer them and talk about how Israel is a great democratic state like our immigration minister does. You don't publish statements in their support. No, you condemn that act. You stop enabling it. Yeah? It's an abusive situation, an abusive relationship. Yeah? And that's what we have to think about. But we must do it also in a way that respects that it's not enough, actually.